Ben Rhodes was Deputy National Security Advisor under President Barack Obama. His latest book is After the Fall, Being American in the World We Made. Maybe you know him from his podcast, Pod Save the World. He recently wrote a piece for the New York Times, and at the risk of violating the speechwriter's code, I'm going to read what I consider to be the most important graph. I do worry that Democrats walked into the trap of defending the very institutions, the establishment, that most Americans distrust. As a party interested in competent technocracy, we lost touch with the anger people feel at government. As a party that prizes data, we seized on indicators of growth and job creation as proof that the economy was booming, even though people felt crushed by rising costs. As a party motivated by social justice, we let revulsion at white Christian nationalism bait us into identity politics on their terms, whether it was debates about transgender athletes, the busing of migrants to cities, or shaming racist MAGA personalities who can't be shamed. As a party committed to American leadership of a rules-based international order, we defended a national security enterprise that has failed repeatedly in the 21st century and made ourselves hypocrites through unconditional military support of Israel's bombardment of civilians in Gaza. It was a pretty sweeping piece. That was the paragraph that really jumped out at me. And Ben, first, let me welcome you to The Gist. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Mike.
Did you, what do you think? Give me your assessment, your self-assessment of that paragraph. Was I right to say that's just about the nut graph of this speech?
Yeah, you're right about it. That's the heart of the argument that I wanted to make. It's a factor that I've been increasingly concerned about, Mike, not just in the United States, but I travel a lot. I talk to mainly kind of center-left politicians in Europe, where the exact same dynamic is in play. You know, we as people to the left, usually are predisposed to be distrustful of, the national security establishment, the military-industrial enterprise, concentrated power, the inequities of democracy. But because we kind of made ourselves oppositional to Trump, and the same thing has happened in Europe as well, to kind of the far right there, suddenly we're the defenders of the establishment writ large. And you could put an umbrella over that whole paragraph. It's the establishment. Right. And we let ourselves essentially, I think, be baited into defending the very institutions and the very establishment that Americans and people around the world just think is completely broken. And that may sound, Trump adjacent. I obviously don't agree with where Trump takes that critique, but I think that as we reflect on what happened, I'm less interested, Mike, in whether Kamala Harris should have gone on Joe Rogan or what this tactical decision. This, to me, is the mega problem of the last decade, is Democrats just defending an establishment that most Americans believe has failed.
So is part of your critique that by composition, by instinct, that Democrats should be more of the anti-establishment and Republicans should be, the natural order of things is Republicans to represent the establishment, and then the Republicans or the current ilk of Republicans pull the jujitsu on the Democrats?
That's basically what I think. I mean, Mike, you have to remember the only two presidential campaigns I ever worked on were for Barack Obama. I freely acknowledge I was lucky to work for it helps when it's an incredibly charismatic politician. But Obama was a profoundly anti-establishment figure. He ran against Hillary Clinton, the kind of embodiment of the Democratic establishment in the 2008 primary. He was against the Iraq War. He was against kind of consolidated corporate power. It was a pretty populist campaign. And to me, it's not a coincidence that the dominant political figures, and I say this in the Times piece as well, the two dominant political figures since the financial crisis, which to me is when the establishment collapsed, are Barack Obama and Donald Trump, two in very different ways, but what they have in common is they're political outsiders. Obama had only been in Washington for 2 years. He's obviously the first black president. He was kind of an independent cultural figure in the same way that Trump's an independent cultural figure. And I think Democrats kind of lost that populism. And if you just look at, Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, it's hard to put this on Kamala Harris because, she had like 100 days as nominee, but we kind of reverted to establishment politics when the mood of the country was anything but that.
Okay, so establishment is debatable, but to me, institutionalist is not, and not just because of the Trump era. I do think that, and you talk about technocrats, I read the part about technocrats, I do think that Barack Obama always evinced and represented competence. So if the party is going to be institutionalists, maybe they're thrust into that role. Maybe Donald Trump did something to make them seen as institutionalists. A good way out of that is to be able to point to the institutions and say, they're doing something for you. And Democrats have always done that. Look, government could be your friend. The CDC is working. Look at the rates of, pellagra in the United States over the last 120 years. So it's part of it that at a time when Democrats were put in a position of having to point to the institutions and having the Americans think that they worked. Was the problem mostly that Americans were under the wrong impression that they didn't work, or that their anger was based on a lot of justified sentiment?
Yeah, it's a complicated question, and I want to acknowledge, Mike, freely here that I don't, I'm sure I'm wrong about some things. I've learned, one of the things I've learned is to doubt my own, infallibility over the last decade. But here's what I'm wrestling with, Mike, because I share your view. I want competent government. And to me, we're living through a populist age. I think that, the argument I make in that piece is also that the system's kind of collapsed. When I walked into government, the systems had collapsed. The national security enterprise had kind of collapsed through the mistake of the Iraq War. The kind of financial system had collapsed, literally, through the great financial crisis. But also that was globalization kind of collapsing it. This wasn't working for people. The whole system of post-Cold War globalization, standards of living are rising, trade is expanding, the migration of people is working. We're in a kind of post-conflict environment, democracy is inevitable. That had collapsed by the time I walked in the door with Barack Obama in 2009. And so you need some populism. And to me, what Trump has done is he's kind of targeted the populism against government competence. The Tony Fauci, the CDC, faceless bureaucrats. To me, and again, this is just my view. What people should really be angry about is kind of rampant wealth inequality, corporate concentration of power. But Trump has kind of redirected. He takes some shots at those people, and his anti-free trade politics, I think, was smart, and no different than Bernie Sanders' anti-free trade agreement politics. But he's kind of redirected people's anger towards government itself and towards bureaucrats, and that's actually an old play. That's like a Reagan play, I don't think I don't blame those people. In my field, the national security, I think there's probably more to blame on kind of an enterprise that is overreached and has not kind of self-policed enough. I don't think that means you put the Fox and Friends guy in charge of the Pentagon and Kash Patel in charge of the FBI. But
to be fair, he's the weekend Fox.
Weekend Fox and Friends. But I do think that we for whatever reason, maybe it's because Bernie was defeated in successive primaries. It made us look kind of anti-populist, and so we lost. There was no populism really to the Harris campaign or to the Biden campaign in 2020 or to the Hillary campaign in 2016. None of that. I remember we used to have a joke, Mike, in the Obama speechwriting team in 2008 that the biggest applause line in every speech was not about electing the first black president. It was about, it's time to stop giving tax breaks to companies that ship jobs overseas and start giving tax breaks to companies that create them here in the United States. Like people wanted to hear that you were going to kind of go after, the kind of corporate mindset or profit mad mindset that had kind of ravaged American communities. And we lost that. And maybe it's because, again, Bernie was defeated in successive primaries. Maybe it's because the leadership of the Democratic Party, not just a Joe Biden, but a Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, were kind of people who had been in Washington for many decades and had just kind of didn't have that outsider credibility that like a Trump seemed to inherently have. But we lost populism as an ingredient in the Democratic message, and that put us out of step with, I think, where the electorate is. Now, a lot of my Democratic colleagues would say, but our policies were better than the Republican policies in addressing that. But Joe Biden did invest an enormous amount of money in building infrastructure in this country and bringing manufacturing back to this country. That's all true. But I think policy alone is not enough. It's the story you are telling to people. And what for a lot of reasons, the story we were telling with people kind of didn't land with where they felt they were.
Yeah. So for the record, Donald Trump did give tax breaks to American companies, though, didn't he?
Yeah, he did, but he also...
So that was the good applause line for your president, but Trump did deliver on it, and he got credit for it, or got credit for the tax breaks that he oversaw. I mean, he delivered on populism to a great degree. Whether it was the best tax cut, the biggest thing he got credit for was a good economy while he was president, which meant that all the standard measures of economy, but also people felt like it was a good economy. So he's a good salesman. And the Biden administration, we could both agree that if you line up America against the other countries in the world, the economy, quote unquote, is better. But the reason it doesn't feel like that might not just be because of feelings. It might be because, as you write, as a party invested in competent technocracy, we lost touch with the anger people feel at government. As a party that prizes data, we seized on job growth and job creation as proof the economy was booming. I mean, that could be, it's not that the message was wrong or people were feeling something wrong. You were looking at the wrong data points. The inflation data point is enormous, and I don't know that the Biden administration appreciated that enough.
Look, 100% agree with you on that last point you made. I would say this about the Trump tax policies. That tax cut was overwhelmingly weighted to the wealthy.
It was.
Just factually, like it was mainly corporate tax cuts, high income tax cuts. So it juiced the economy, but it continued to exacerbate inequality. One of the things I think we got wrong in the first Trump term is we would chase the thing he tweeted, or he'd stand up and he'd draw on a picture of a hurricane with a Sharpie and we'd all talk about what a moron he was or something. When in fact that tax cut should have been our focus. This guy's taking care of his rich friends. This guy is juicing the economy largely for the wealthy. I think one of the hardest things in economic messaging, Mike, is that there's a tail to what you do. So it's not like Trump had any responsibility for the economy in the first year or two of the Trump administration. That was the economy they've been set up.
Absolutely, right.
Now, so what he does is then he juices the economy. It's feeling really good up until COVID. Then there's this kind of artificial collapse. And part of what people forget, Trump did 2 massive COVID stimulus. And then Biden comes in. And then I think Biden's made this mistake. And people were saying at the time, you don't need another massive stimulus. There've already been 2. But he kind of wanted to have his own stimulus, and so I think there was already inflationary pressure in the economy. We're coming out of COVID. Trump has just juiced things. Frankly, the tariffs on China, that drives up inflation because it makes things more expensive because supply chains are broken up. And so then Biden exacerbates inflation with that first big stimulus. And he's fighting the last war, right? So in the Obama years, jobs were the indicator that everybody was watching. And so he's looking at these jobs numbers and they're great. It's historically low unemployment. But he waited too long to realize that wasn't what people were focused on. They were focused on how much everything cost. Despite warnings, and this is one of the...
they should be, by the way.
Right? I totally agree, right?
Yeah, not a perception thing, a real ability to pay for things, and wages are now passing inflation, but we haven't even made up for how much inflation took out of people's pockets.
That's exactly right. And he made this, beyond the decision to run, he made this decision to brand the entire economy Bidenomics, which again, if the economy is not working for people, what you want to say, we went through this in when Obama ran for re-election, we'd not turned the corner really yet.
Right. And the slur was Obamacare. And then he, because he's this excellence communicator, says, that's fine, I do care. And I don't know, I think Obamacare doesn't have the pejorative sense that Bidenomics does.
That's right. But Obama ran that entire re-election campaign on the future. We got to keep literally the tagline was forward, and it was about like, we're not there yet, but we got to keep going. Biden kind of was starting to run a victory lap campaign, about his accomplishments, and was just so out of step with where people were. And so I agree with you on the this is about how people were feeling, and it was about outcomes. But I don't think part of the failing of Democratic messaging was to not mount a kind of populist critique about who benefited the most from that Trump tax cut. Instead, because we get offended by things Trump says on a day-to-day basis, we're focusing on that. And it's also like a hyper online mindset of like, you assume everybody's following the crazy thing Trump said. They're not. Most people don't have time to like pay attention to some Washington controversy about, Trump saying he wanted to buy Greenland or something like that. Or even some impeachment controversy where, he made a phone call to Zelensky. They're focused on like, how are they doing? And I think we became so oppositional to Trump that we weren't closing the deal with people on how they were feeling.
That's in your essay too. And so as we've been talking, you talked about the need for populist messaging. We've gotten away from populist messaging. You pointed to Bernie Sanders as an exemplar from that. Great example. But I am of the belief that if you're going to be the data-driven technocratic party, and that fits my personality, so I guess it's why I almost always vote Democrat when there's a good actual technocrat who's using really good data, which is my point, that if you're going to be the technocratic data-driven company, you have to be good at it. And I think that you just pointed out some massive errors that the so-called technocrats made. If Bernie Sanders is the exemplar of a populist message, and Bernie Sanders was clamoring for not the $1.9 trillion stimulus that contributed greatly to inflation, but was clamoring for a $3.5 trillion stimulus, what is really in actual terms the way forward to seem populist, but not also so mismanage the economy that you're definitely going to get punished?
Yeah, this is, I think, the core question that Democrats need to figure out, because I don't necessarily think that the answer is a kind of pure redistribution of wealth and spend money populism. I think part of it is who is the economy working for, and actually Democrats have a lot of ideas about how to make the economy work better for working people. But part of it is like, we're going to crack down on tax avoidance, on corporate malfeasance, we are going to change the tax code at the very top so that, billionaires are paying a greater share. And then we're going to take the burden off people. The cost of housing, cost of living. I think there are ways to do this that aren't, necessarily Medicare for all. That are about a combination of kind of reforming how the economy works, to crack down on abuse, to crack down on inequality, and then just helping relieve the burden on working people. That doesn't come with the multi-trillion-dollar price tags. Interestingly, Kamala Harris circled around this message, and the kind of policies she introduced were in line with this, but it wasn't kind of the main characteristic of her campaign. And there were even some reports that she kind of let up on the gas, in terms of calling out corporate malfeasance and kind of going after the billionaires because, maybe some donors got to her or something.
She had more millionaire donors than anyone else. And apparently, her brother-in-law who's a Wall Street guy, was very keen on saying, listen, you got to have the millionaires donate. And by the way, your old boss recognized this. And he probably didn't get more of the Wall Street vote than, say, Mitt Romney did, but he tried to.
But the benefit he had, which again, I freely acknowledge is not because of people like me who worked for him, it's because he had a cultural appeal.
Yes. Is
he had such a big, small donor base that he could piss off a lot of those people, and it was okay. He could fund his campaign, and there was a populism in that too. There was a sense that when Obama came on the scene in 2008, people were aware of this kind of small donor bit. And so there was a sense that he's not owned by anybody. This is Trump's, I think the first time I took Trump seriously was in one of those Republican debates in 2016 when he called out everybody on stage and said, essentially, all these people are bought and paid for by donors. I'm not, so come with me,
Yeah, you're like, that's a good argument. And
it is.
That cuts through. And it's actually rare for Trump. True.
Yeah. And Obama could
I don't know. Maybe you could argue that some sovereign wealth fund of Qatar might have some stake in his success. But
this is the other thing I'd say is that there's an argument to be made now about, again, follow the money, right? The corruption that's going to come. I mean, did anybody mention? Did it feature at all in the Democratic campaign that Jared Kushner collected $2 billion from Saudi Arabia in between the two Trump terms? That Democrats used to be good at honing in on that kind of corruption. But again, I think we're so focused on the democracy message, which I understand. I care a lot. That book you mentioned is all about autocracy and the kind of playbook of turning democracies into autocracies. But ultimately, that's whether we like it or not, people don't tend to vote on that. They tend to vote on what's going on in their lives. And corruption is something that is more visceral. And by the way, corruption connects the democracy and the economic message, because it's basically these people aren't trying to help you. They're just trying to get rich. They're going to go collect checks in the Gulf. He's going to monetize his control of the U.S. government. And that to me is even a better way into the democracy discussion than talking about some of the things that Democrats fixate on, and then I include myself that I've talked about a lot the last 8 years.
And I don't begrudge an expert in autocracy, or let us consider you some sort of real life lived experience expert, being worried about that.
Yeah.
But it also, to me, it wasn't a great message, because it was clear that the Democrats giving the message, the elite of the Democratic Party, weren't waking up in cold sweats thinking about it. They didn't like where it was going, but by indications such as, well, I'll be very blunt and mean, letting Joe Biden be the bulwark to save democracy. It doesn't communicate to America that you think this is existential, or just, playing patty cake with the more autocratic leaning candidates in Republican primaries and trying to fund them because you think they'd be easier to beat. That also doesn't speak to, and I don't know how many people are paying attention to that level, but that doesn't speak to, you really, really do think that the country is, not going to have another election if there is a president. And the third thing is, I think we all know the country is going to have another election. But when you tell the public this is democracy is on the line, and then when you tease out what that really means, I don't know that the public, who doesn't pay that much attention to every tweet, really defines what you're calling democracy as what they're calling democracy.
Yeah, I mean, what I agree with entirely with what you said is, if there's an existential threat to democracy, you would not run someone who's going to be 86 years old at the end of the second term in the face of polling. I mean, the thing that was so jarring, Mike, is that in beginning of 2023, the beginning of the cycle, 70, 80% of people in every poll said he was too old to be president.
Right.
And so if you
go into a gunfight with a gun that you think is going to work, that's one thing. If you know the gun keeps jamming, that's on you.
Well, it's like a sport. I'll take a sports metaphor. Like if you're playing Game 7 and everything's on the line, and you probably wouldn't start an injured player. So it did kind of undermine the point that it was existential. I think the other point you made, it's not that he's going to be, and this is where I think we got carried away with the dictator point. It's not that he's going to cancel elections and there's never going to be another election. In part, frankly, I might actually be more worried about that if Donald Trump wasn't 78 years old, but he's a term limited guy who's going to be 82 years old at the end of next term. To me, the bigger point is, again, connecting this to people's lives. When I look at other democracies that have become kind of soft autocracies, when you're talking about a Hungary, you're talking about a Turkey, you're talking about, unfortunately, a whole range of countries right now. It's the what happens to the government. It becomes captured by a ruling family or party. And essentially, what I worry about, that might be about to happen, is someone who does care about competent government, is he's going to come in, he's going to break all these agencies, he's going to politicize institutions like the military and the Department of Justice, and there's going to be rampant corruption. It's going to be a field day. If you're an ally of Donald Trump, if you're Elon Musk, or if you're Jared Kushner, or you're whomever, the rules are going to be manipulated to your benefit. And that by the time, let's say, a Democrat gets elected in 4 years, they're going to inherit kind of a broken government, populated with ideologues, in ways that I think it's hard for Americans to understand. You don't repair that in 4 years or 8 years, And so,
no, you're right. That could happen, but that's not. But Americans aren't motivated by that per se.
Yeah, well, clearly not, or else she would have won. Yeah.
Yeah. So here's what I think, since you prefaced your statement saying, look, I could be a little bit wrong, throwing it out there, but, it's where my thoughts take me. I think that it was a very long shot for Kamala Harris to win this election, mostly because of what we know about the anti-incumbency trends throughout the world, having a lot to do with inflation, not of anyone's choosing except Vladimir Putin and supply chains. Fine. I do think it was possible. And I think the way for Democrats to do that is more to be good at the stuff that you wrote in the antecedent clauses of your paragraph that I read. As a party invested in competent technocracy, my solution would be you got to be more competent. You got to get it right. As a party that prizes data, you got to use better data. As a party, I'm going to go on, as a party motivated by social justice, well, that's good, but how do you define social justice? And are you being dragged along to fights for social justice that don't resonate with the people? Are you using your capital on definitions of social justice that aren't really justice or aren't helping society as a whole enough as a party committed to American leadership on rules-based international order? I mean, that's nice, but do you really commit to upholding the ICC's, which we're not a part of, their ruling to arrest Gallant and Netanyahu? So it seems to me that these are actually hard choices in the beginning of all the sentences that you put forward, and you have to do them really, really good if you're a Democrat and you want to win. And my analysis is just the Democrats, Harris, the party, didn't do them good enough. And I don't know if you did, the people would give you credit, but that's what you have to do.
Yeah, I think there's another piece to it. It's this, and this is the speechwriter in me. So I have a speechwriter's bias. But you have to tell a story about what you're doing and where this is all going. And this is what Obama was good at. And this is why I think he got a second term, even though people weren't feeling not much better in 2012. Things really picked up in the economy in the second Obama term. Obamacare started to work in the second Obama term, not the first. And so you have to tie together, what all these things are, competence. I mean, to take the social justice piece, for instance. To me, at core, it's just about fairness. People should be treated fairly. People should have an equal shot at everything in this country. And that's it. And not chasing every fight, and this is where I think the online discourse has sometimes captured Democrats. And I made this point about shaming, but, we'd find the most outrageous thing that some MAGA person said, and we'd have a whole debate about that, when the reality is often the Republican Party wants to have these debates on their terms. It's not the Democrats that chose to foreground trans issues in a lot of places. It was the Republicans, and the point here is that we're not here to because I think that what the argument is that Republicans want is a sense that Democrats care more about certain groups than you, right?
Right.
And it's particularly you, white working class. They don't care about you. They want to help these people over here. And the point is, that's not and Obama would always say this, the point is, no, we just want to treat everybody the same, everybody fairly.
So this is why Obama, and it's not a messaging thing, I think if he were given the choice to prioritize black farmers as the recipient of aid before farmers of other races, and there are a lot of reasons why black farmers have absolutely been discriminated against, but you tell me, history shows, or in all the times he had an opportunity to do that, he never did. He always said, no, we're here to help all people. And obviously, since black farmers certainly need the help the most based on all sorts of empirical data, they'll get the help the most, but we're not going to prioritize it. And then once you have have, and it's not just black farmers, but it's, or I shouldn't call it bailouts, relief during COVID that were sometimes racialized, all thrown out by the courts. These are missteps. And I don't know, maybe the Biden administration rolls their eyes and says it's unfair, but these missteps accrue and hurt you in the next election, I think.
Well, he would always say, essentially, like sometimes people would come to him and say, well, what have you done, for the black community, for instance? And he would say, Obamacare. A lot of black people got health care from Obamacare. It wasn't a policy designed for a particular racial constituency, but a policy that helps people who a lot of black people have pre-existing conditions. And so even those pre-existing condition protections in the Obamacare, the idea that you can't get kicked off your health care because of a pre-existing condition, even those are colorblind, it did a lot to help people in the black community, and
that's a great answer. And maybe Obama could say it in a way that Biden couldn't say it, because he's not going to be assailed, from anyone this side of Eddie Glaude on a charge of racism. But it's a great answer. It's a better answer. It's a politically better answer.
Yeah, no, it is, because it's fundamentally about, and I think the Democratic Party generally, fairness and opportunity are usually our strongest grounds, because I think there's an ingrained sense that, again, Trump has tried to kind of jumble, but that, we started with the establishment. There's this ingrained sense that the Republican Party is generally the party of at least the business establishment, the corporate establishment, wealthier people, and that Democrats are for more fairness in the economy and more opportunity for more people. And I think what the Republicans try to do is create a perception that Democrats are not for everybody. Actually, they're only for certain groups of people. They slice and dice identity politics and try to protect certain groups over the interests of other groups. I don't think that's true, actually, but I do think we kind of walk into that with some of our messaging, or we get kind of pulled into these fights. And instead of just having a kind of one big universal message that we're using about the kind of country that we're working for, so the competence part is really important, but I do think it needs to be accompanied by like a story. And part of the challenge, right, is that Hillary Clinton wasn't she was about competence, but she was not like a very nimble politician, shall we say, in terms of her ability to tell that story. Joe Biden, I think, just because of age, he couldn't kind of fill the space. Even at the higher moments of his presidency, he just couldn't kind of capture attention and tell a story about. Because I could add up all the things he did and say, well, look at this guy, He invested in the biggest investment in domestic manufacturing in X number of years, and the biggest investment in infrastructure in X number of years, and he actually increased the trade competition with China to the benefit of American workers, and he walked on a picket line. He did a bunch of stuff that were proof points that he cared about everybody in this country, and particularly the working class. But he never really told the story, and when he did, it was about like accomplishments. It was like, I accomplished this. Look at this piece of legislation. Nobody knows about that. Like nobody, unless you're following the ins and outs of politics, you don't know what the CHIPS Act is, or what the IRA is, or what the bipartisan infrastructure law is. You need the story that tells people what it is. And the other problem is, like Mike, is that we had a lot of this in the Obama years. A lot of the bills he passed are going to now come to fruition in the next few years. Most of that money has not been spent on infrastructure yet, on clean energy yet. And so he had to tell a story about why these aren't done. This is a work in progress that needs to continue. And that was
That's true, but it's also one of the reasons the bills get passed. I don't need to tell you this, but if you push them out into the future, the grading in terms of the budget is more lenient for you. So you could say we're not hurting our deficit. I do want to ask you. I want to get a little bit to international affairs. I do have to ask you though, what you just said. Are the Democrats dependent on literally gifted communicators to win the presidency? Because Obama, Clinton, and everyone short of them, which is to say the two most gifted communicators of my lifetime from the Democratic Party, anyone short of them, hasn't won except for Joe Biden during that pandemic year. So is that too high a bar for Democrats?
I think we do need a gifted communicator, or at least it's a lot easier because we have a more fractured coalition. We're ethnically diverse. We are. We have a lot of different interests under one big umbrella. And whereas like Trump was basically about consolidating, for lack of a better way of putting it, the white vote, and then making inroads, kind of peeling off people, particularly Latinos. We got to hold this whole thing together. And it does kind of take a certain figure to be deft. Bill Clinton could appeal to a white working class Southerner and like an urban black community. He was as comfortable in a black church as he was in a small town. Barack Obama he could stand up there and give a speech, and those different constituencies could all see themselves in what Obama was saying. If you're not a gifted communicator, what you end up doing is having different messages for these different audiences.
Yes.
And people smell that, And so
one of the things that a gifted or otherwise communicator has to communicate is no. And with a fractured coalition, that's hard sometimes.
That's right. But you have to have the strength. What's interesting is that Obama did quite well with Latino voters, and he said no on immigration. They called him the deporter in chief, and he said yes on some things. He said, "I'm going to protect the dreamers. I'm going to protect children who are brought here protect people who are brought here as children. But I'm not going to protect everybody who comes in here illegally." And that caused some friction. But he did better with Latinos than Kamala Harris did, and then Joe Biden did. And so people, it's also a mistake to make an assumption that the loudest voices in each constituency are wholly representative of the entire constituency.
Okay, I have to ask you, since you are an author of foreign United States foreign policy to some extent, and you were a negotiator. Question one: what is most in America's interest in what we're seeing in Syria? The perpetuation of the Assad regime, or you tell me the factions that the rebels who have now apparently overtaken Aleppo, who they represent? Who should the United States be rooting for?
There's no simple answer to that. I wish there was. Essentially, the factions that have taken over Aleppo are largely Islamist factions, some of which had fairly extremist ties dating back to the time when I was in government, some of which get a lot of support from Turkey, and how they would govern is TBD. We just don't know.
They're not ISIL. They're not the Taliban.
No.
They're maybe more like Kurds who we backed in coalitions in the Battle of Mosul, for instance.
Well, it's a little different than that. So then they're the Kurds, and that's who we've generally backed because they are not Islamic extremists. They do not have ties to terrorist organizations. The Turks think they do because they think that there are Kurds inside of Turkey that have committed acts of terrorism. But by and large, if you've got Assad, and he represents kind of Iranian interests and Russian interests inside of Syria, and a really obviously brutal government that has killed a lot of its own people, then you've got Kurds that are largely backed by the United States, and we kind of still have guys in Syria, and we try to help protect these Kurds who helped us fight and defeat ISIS. And then you've got this kind of mishmash of Sunni Muslim groups, largely, that are in places like Idlib and Aleppo. Those are kind of, it's an oversimplification, but those are the three factions that are kind of battling it out. I actually don't think it's necessarily, we don't like Assad. Right now, I think what you kind of want is you just want to get this into some kind of negotiated coexistence between these factions. What you don't want is an all-out civil war again, which is going to cause mass flows of people. It creates openings for extremists like ISIS to regenerate. You kind of want this thing to stop and this to become a version of what Lebanon used to be before the lid was blown off, but essentially like a negotiated coexistence. So there's stability, so that innocent people aren't getting killed, so that terrorists can't get a foothold. That right now, I think, is probably what the U.S. government is advocating. Because if the groups that overrun Aleppo overrun the whole country, there's just a tremendous amount of uncertainty about, okay, who are these people? Are they ready to govern? Will they start massacring the people that they defeated? Will they become the Taliban? Like, we just don't know. And so you want to kind of not have this become militarized.
Right. Chaos is almost always worse than stability. Then again, the stability is the stability of Assad, who's almost worse than anyone. My question for you is, would your answer have been different pre-Arab Spring? When I think the idea was the entrenched powers in the Middle East are so bad, let's try something new. And then I know that, for instance, you were in favor of Hosni Mubarak's removal, and that didn't work out very well, not huge bloodbaths. But I'll go back to my question. Were you informed, and was the promise changed by what we've seen in the last, say, 13 years?
Yeah, I think that the fundamental issue is that there's something unsustainable about this degree of autocracy. And I will always believe that. Bashar al-Assad does not govern in a way that is in the interest of the vast majority of his people. It's just a perpetuation of a kind of corrupt autocratic regime. And that's always going to be a lid on a boiling pot, And it was the same thing was true under Mubarak. The same thing is true under Sisi, the autocrat who governs Egypt now. And so you either have to have some kind of incremental process of improving those circumstances for the people in those countries, or it's going to repeatedly blow. And I after the failure of the Arab Spring, I remember thinking, well, this is just going to happen again in 10, 15, 20 years unless these places change. They're not. Some of the people in that region kind of understand this. I've been a huge critic of the Gulf countries, of Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia, of some of the Emiratis. I will say they're aware of this dynamic, and they're at least trying to evolve their economies, not their political systems, so that there's less kind of desperation. Now, it's easier for them to do that when you're sitting on trillions of dollars worth of oil and you can kind of spread that money around. Syria doesn't have that. Egypt doesn't have that. Jordan doesn't have that. What I think is likely to happen in the Trump years that people are not anticipating is I think it's going to be quite possibly an Arab Spring 2.0 in places like Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, that you can feel the lid beginning to shake on top of the boiling pot. The conflict in Gaza is going to contribute to that, particularly if there are Palestinians coming into places like Jordan and Egypt. Unfortunately, I think we may be in for another round of this.
I want to ask you about the Iran nuclear weapons deal. I don't expect you to say anything other than it was worth a try, and I supported it at the time. In retrospect, I'm not so sure, because it did seem vulnerable to the next president, be it Donald Trump or Marco Rubio or whoever, exiting from it. And if you enter any deal, we're a democracy. Every 4 years, different presidents might come in, and it seems like half of our political system is against such a deal. That's a little vulnerable. And I also give more credit now than I do at the time. One of the arguments. So one of the arguments was Iran's going to cheat, of course, and then you have to monitor it. That I'll give you. But Iran was using, or did use, a lot of the money to fund Hezbollah and these forces around the world, and that led for more disruption and more chaos and war than would have otherwise happened. So I'll just ask you, in the hindsight of history, could you have done the deal any differently or at all?
Look, I mean, on this one, I fully acknowledge I obviously was a participant. But I actually believe it's been validated. It was, the Iranians were not cheating. They were complying with the deal to the extent that even, in the first Trump term, it took him 2 years to withdraw because his own people, including people like Jim Mattis, who'd not been big supporters of the Iran deal at the time, were like, well, it's working. They're complying. We can't. Remember, for those who don't follow this that closely, Trump kept trying to get his government to find Iran in non-compliance so he could pull out. And Trump's own government couldn't find them in non-compliance because they
And then he just did it anyway, yeah.
And so then he just did it anyway. Here we are. They have accelerated their nuclear program to the worst case scenario that everybody's worried about. They basically have stockpiled enough nuclear material that if they decided to try to go out and build a weapon, they have enough to do it. The region is, we're living at the constant precipice of a war between the United States and Iran, which is something we were trying to prevent because we just didn't think the Americans wanted another war in the Middle East. And so to me, the logic of the deal itself clearly holds because I would prefer them to not have that nuclear material. They were shipping it out. There were inspections there. None of that's there anymore. On the money piece, I always took issue with this piece. Iran had the money to fund Hezbollah and these proxies in the aughts. They had it before the Iran deal. They had it after the Iran deal. They have it now. This is not I think what people don't realize is this is not mass sums of money to be, sending, shoulder fired missiles and weapons to Hezbollah. And they create this money. This is in the black market. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps it knows how to do business outside of sanctioned industries, and so I think we have this kind of, here's how I put you, Mike, is you're a data guy. The most sanctioned countries in the world by the United States are Cuba, North Korea, Iran, Venezuela, and Russia. Is that working? I think we have this sense that sanctions somehow force countries to do what we want. And I actually think it's the opposite. I think the more you sanction these countries, the more you kind of entrench the worst actors. Because the guy that can't figure out how to evade sanctions in Iran is like the small business owner in Tehran. The guys with guns and ships that they can smuggle stuff on are going to figure out a way to make money, And so I never bought the money argument. Now, the best argument is in our political system, do you do a deal that only has kind of, does not have the support of the other party?
Yeah, and some notable voices within your own, like Chuck Schumer.
Yeah, but I on that one, I think, I don't know, that's a recipe for never doing anything. The Republicans made themselves so oppositional to Obama that that if we had internalized that logic, it would have been paralyzing to governance because whatever we did, they were going to oppose.
Yeah, it seems to me that there are some types of deal that even if you get a 4 years out of it or 4 years every 8 years, it's still worth it. Paris Accords, League of Nations. And then you have the dynamics of the Iranian deal, which are they sanctions? They're different from Russian sanctions, which are we once had the free flow of commerce, and then there were interdictions to try to prevent that. With Iran, money was frozen and then released, so it's like sort of not so many sanctions, but undesanctioning. I was trying to use a double negative, but I think you get all that. It's a hard choice. I don't think it's worked out well. I understand the hope. I think that maybe I'm beginning to think more and more that the optimism and we got to try for something hopeful and non-militaristic was doomed to fail. And often is.
I don't know. I'd say two things. Nothing was lost. We got those restrictions on the Iranian program for a few years. We had inspections for a few years. The sanctions relief was not, by the way, it wasn't like it was a check written to Iran. This is how it was always. A bunch of money was frozen and entangled in bank transactions because of our sanctions. The Iranians didn't get the majority of the money because banks were so worried about doing any business with Iran to begin with. So nothing was lost in that time, by doing that deal. And so I don't know. I always, what I find frustrating with the whole discourse around American foreign policy, particularly in this region, is there's a default that there's a scrutiny on the hawkish position is not scrutinized in the same way that, say, the Iran deal is scrutinized. Nobody's saying, hey, are these maximum pressure sanctions on Iran working? Because they sure don't seem like they've been behaving the way we want to under maximum pressure sanctions. Nobody said, people say, look at everything that's happened since the Iran deal. It's like, well, look at everything that's happened since the Abraham Accords. We don't say that all that's because of the Abraham Accords. So there's a kind of weird default in national security discussions where America's expected to do the most heavy-handed, hawkish, maximum pressure thing, and there's this intense scrutiny on any deviation from that. But there's not scrutiny on, why do we perpetuate these approaches that don't work?
Yeah, I do think that had your administration just continued on with the sanctions, Iran would be weaker. Weakened Iran would mean less death and chaos in the region. Maybe it would. I also think, well, you tell me, that there was an assumption that, for instance, they're not going to stop funding Hezbollah, and Hezbollah is going to be so strong that they're going to be almost impossible to uproot. And at least some of that has been either disproved or, seriously been put in question.
Well, I guess what I'd say, though, is like people say weaker Iran. They're weaker, but they're still there. There's still an Iranian Revolutionary Guard, and weakness, an implosion of the Iranian state tomorrow. I think the Iranian Revolutionary Guard are the ones that emerge from that because they're the ones with guns. So I think sometimes, or even right now in Lebanon, Israel's gone in and killed a bunch of Hezbollah leaders in the past, and they regenerate.
Well, nothing like this, though.
Well, maybe nothing on this scale, but let's see what happens. I get my point is that there's this endless cycle, and each time it flares up, it seems to be worse. And so I don't know. I don't know that personally. I don't believe that what's happening in the Middle East right now feels like, and I could be proven wrong. To me, it doesn't feel like the beginning of something better.
Yeah,
look at Syria.
It doesn't. You'd be warranted to say it doesn't actually feel like an end.
But yeah, look at Syria. You were just asking me about a bunch of guys that were once designated as Al Qaeda, beginning to take over Syria. Probably because they sense that Hezbollah is weaker. So my point is you create these vacuums in the Middle East, you kill a bunch of people, you create a bunch of unrest, you create a bunch of civil strife, and often what comes out of that is worse, And I tend to believe that if we could negotiate outcomes like the Iran deal is trying to do, like obviously, people used to try to do on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, ultimately there'd be more durability to negotiated outcomes than these kind of militarized zero-sum outcomes that, tend to generate more conflict and more extremism.
So, Ben, you'd be great guy to talk to. I have to ask you one last question because it always occurs to me, and I, in a few months, haven't had a person who was in your position who actually makes these decisions. So I want to talk about the United States' ability to exert pressure or leverage. And I'll read you the lead from a New York Times, a recent Times story about the truce with Hezbollah. The truce in Lebanon was possible in part because Hezbollah, weakened by months of assassinations and battlefield losses, had lost its leverage at the negotiating table. Then it goes on to say Netanyahu could afford compromise. But this idea of oftentimes what ends a conflict, or at least leads to a ceasefire, is that one side massively loses leverage. Does U.S. administration, when it thinks about how to exert pressure on Israel, does it flat out say, well, our leverage with the Israelis is we give them all these weapons, and after that, the only thing we could do to affect the situation is to pressure them into peace deals or to pressure them to stop fighting? Does any administration ever say, actually, the way to peace might be leverage on the other side and not to hem in the Israelis, who probably won't negotiate if they don't think they're winning by a lot?
Well, I think that's been the default, right? In the sense that our leverage on Israel would be, if we chose to use it, that we give them billions and billions of dollars in weapons. I think every plane that's dropped a bomb on Gaza was a U.S. plane, and not flown by Israelis, obviously, but came from us. We also have leverage at the UN. Like, do we vote for a ceasefire at the UN Security Council? And I would argue that Joe Biden has done what you say. I mean, he's exerted no leverage. It doesn't matter what he says or what Biden administration officials say on background. With the exception of a single weapons shipment that was temporarily delayed in the spring, the spigot's been on for weapons. The veto has been used at the UN Security Council, and we've seen essentially the policy of the Israeli government's right wing be predominant. I don't agree with that approach. I think that flattening Gaza and potentially depopulating it, trying to create, make it unlivable so people leave, it may be a short-term military achievement in some fashion, but I just think that's a recipe for a lot more. Not only do I think that's a humanitarian catastrophe for Palestinians, I think it's also a recipe for further long-term, medium and long-term chaos in that region. And I also think I think the U.S. does lose something intangible when the rest of the world looks at us and say, "Hey, you've been making these arguments about Putin being, the amount of civilian casualties in Ukraine. You guys selectively apply these standards." That's how the rest of the world sees us. With Trump's election, that's certainly how they see us, and I think we're going to miss that. I think we're going to, if we're just another big country that only operates in self-interest. I think we're going to miss the idea that there was supposed to be rules that our team was supposed to follow. Because I think we're heading into a world of pure transactionalism, and I don't feel optimistic about what that world's going to feel like.
But if Joe Biden has failed in ever exerting leverage, and we have these bombs being dropped on civilians who don't deserve it, shouldn't we conclude that that is not a winning strategy? Could a different president have exerted more pressure on Netanyahu or even the Israeli public, given where they are psychologically and literally militarily? I would just think in terms of game theory, the way to get one side to the negotiating table is not to authorize war crimes, but to allow the Israelis to do what they've fought the United States to an extent to do anyway, which is to really, really dominate their enemy. That's how to get the ceasefire.
Well, but it's. I don't think they want to cease. That's not a ceasefire. I mean, these things have been conflated in the sense that
they want to defeat Hamas, and
they want to destroy Hamas. So that's not, by definition, that Hamas, precisely because of who they are, they're not going to come out and say we've been defeated.
Right. But there'll be no one left to give a press release.
It's not a ceasefire. It's the destruction of Hamas.
Okay.
Now the problem
that would end the war.
But the problem that I see, Mike, is that in Gaza, I don't see the Israeli government making much distinction between a Palestinian civilian and Hamas, to be blunt. Mm-hmm. And at a certain point, I still think that, and I really don't mean this to sound, sanctimonious or something. There has to be some right and wrong in all this. And the scale of death in Gaza, the scale of destruction in Gaza, to me, should make us uncomfortable. And at a certain point, the U.S. says, we just can't give you weapons to do this. Now,
and you think that point has passed?
I think that point has passed. The time to do that would have been, a year ago.
But the thing that I'm struggling with is, do you, or maybe others of your ilk, and I know you have an NGO with Jake Sullivan who's very important on these issues, do you have these moral, and I'm actually not putting Jake or ascribing any of your opinions to Jake, but do you have this moral commitment that is, let's call it, it's fine morality. It's totally understandable morality. But because of this moral commitment of we can't countenance this, you're not willing or able to give the possible correct advice, which is you got to win this war and then we'll stop. You can't bring yourself to say that.
I'd rather. This is a much longer conversation, but essentially, I believe if you drain morality out of American foreign policy, then we become no different than Russia or China, and then we're back in kind of pre-World War I, law of the jungle. There's a reason all these rules were written after World War II.
But if we define morality as the ending of suffering of civilians, I think it's possible that my way of, or what my suggestion is you got to win the war, ends it earlier, and stops the suffering of civilians. It actually. I don't think the
Israelis have been restrained at all. And I think we see that result in Gaza. And look, Mike, I'll be honest with you. Like, I'm an outlier in my tribe of national security people. I mean, it's probably a reason why I'm not back in government. I was uncomfortable. But I'm comfortable being uncomfortable with that degree of killing. I don't think that to me, that's not the right answer. And like I said, there's a reason. Sometimes the Israelis would say, well, look at what you guys did in Dresden, or look at what you did in Hiroshima. And I would always say, that's why everybody got together after World War II and made all these rules so that kind of stuff wouldn't happen again. I just think if we enter in a world with no rules, whether it's China and Taiwan or Russia and Ukraine or, any bigger country next to a smaller country, we're back in the kind of place that got us into world wars. And that's my, I know that's a more, I don't know if nuance is the right word, that's a more enlightened self-interest argument that you have to restrain yourselves. Like America could have killed everybody in Afghanistan that lived in a place run by the Taliban. We didn't do that. I don't think it would have been, I'm not suggesting you were saying we should do that, but I'm suggesting that restraint has a place, because in the world without restraint, we get the kind of conflicts that we wrote rules and created the UN to avoid.
Ben Rhodes was Deputy National Security Advisor under President Barack Obama. We've been talking to him about his recent Times essay, I Study Guys Like Trump. There's a Reason They Keep Winning. Listen to him on the Pod Save the World podcast. And thanks very much. It was an interesting conversation.
Thanks, Mike. Really appreciate it. It's great talking to you.